June 2022. The O2 Arena in London held 20,000 people, but Brian May felt utterly alone. 50 years of performing, half a century of stages and lights and roaring crowds, and none of it had prepared him for this moment. Tonight, he would sing Love of My Life, and tonight, for the first time since 1991, Freddie Mercury would sing it with him. People would call it a hologram, a technical marvel, a beautiful tribute. But Brian knew the truth. It was a door he'd spent 30 years learning to keep closed, and tonight, in front of thousands, he would have to open it again. The Rhapsody Tour had been polished to perfection. Every light cue rehearsed, every screen tested, every moment calibrated for maximum impact. The production team was proud of what they'd created, a virtual duet, blending archival footage with cutting-edge projection technology. They'd shown Brian the mock-ups weeks earlier, excited, certain he would love it. He'd stared at the screen without speaking. Freddie's face, frozen in time from the late 70s, vibrant and impossibly alive. The production team waited for his approval, smiling, expecting tears of joy perhaps, or immediate enthusiasm. Brian had simply nodded. "Let me think about it," he'd said quietly. What he didn't tell them was that the thought of standing beneath that enormous screen, guitar in hand, while Freddie looked down at him, terrified him in ways he couldn't articulate. This wasn't just a performance. It was an exhumation of everything he'd carefully buried to survive the decades since Freddie's death. "Not yet," he'd whispered to himself that night. "I'm not ready. Not in London. Not with that song. Not with Freddie looking back at me." But the tour moved forward, and the technology improved, and eventually there was no more time to be unready. The first technical test happened on an empty stage, 3 days before the London show. The arena was silent, cavernous, echoing with the hollow sounds of equipment being moved and tested. Brian walked onto the stage alone, carrying his acoustic guitar like something precious and fragile. "Ready when you are, Brian," a voice called from the sound desk. "Just look up at the screen when the cue hits. We need to lock the timing." He nodded, though his throat felt tight. The giant screen flickered to life. Static gave way to clarity, and suddenly, Freddie was there. Not an approximation, not a cartoon, not some uncanny CGI recreation. Freddie, exactly as he'd looked in 1979, wearing that simple white shirt, holding a microphone, eyes bright with mischief and warmth. Brian's fingers froze above the guitar strings. His breath caught. Time collapsed. A technician noticed immediately. "Brian, you okay? Should we stop?" He couldn't answer. He could only stare. Every detail was perfect. Too perfect. The slight tilt of Freddie's head when he was about to sing. The way his eyebrows lifted, playful, inviting. The tiny quirks of expression that only someone who'd spent decades beside him would recognize. "Please," Brian whispered, though he wasn't sure what he was asking for. They ran the projection again. He forced himself to play through the sequence, fingers moving on muscle memory while his mind reeled. But when the hologram extended its hand toward him, the gesture Freddie had made 1,000 times on 1,000 stages, Brian couldn't lift his own. His arm remained at his side, trembling. It was too real, too close, too much. He stepped back, shaking his head. "We'll need to adjust the timing," he said, his voice carefully controlled. Everyone in the room knew it wasn't the timing that needed fixing. It was the 30-year-old wound that had never fully healed. Love of My Life had never been meant for stadiums. Freddie had written it in quiet moments, a fragile confession dressed up as a song. Brian remembered sitting in the studio when Freddie first played it, watching him hunch over the piano, completely focused, stripped of all theatrics and showmanship. Just honesty, just vulnerability. The song was about Mary Austin, the woman Freddie called the love of his life, even after their romantic relationship ended. A song about love that bends and fractures and changes shape, but never disappears. That was what made it so devastating to perform now. Because everyone knew it wasn't just about Mary anymore. It had become about Freddie himself. After Freddie died, the song transformed. When Queen performed it, 20,000 people would sing it back to them, their voices carrying a weight of collective grief that Brian could barely withstand. Each voice in the crowd was singing to Freddie, saying goodbye to a man they'd never met but somehow loved deeply. So when the production team proposed the hologram duet, Brian understood why it would be powerful. He also understood why it might destroy him. In the rehearsals that followed, he tried to steel himself. They ran through the sequence again and again. Each time, Freddie appeared on that screen, impossibly alive, impossibly gone. Each time, Brian felt the ground shift beneath him. Roger Taylor watched from the wings one afternoon, arms crossed. When the rehearsal ended, he walked over quietly. "You don't have to do this, you know." Brian adjusted his guitar strap, not meeting Roger's eyes. "Yes, I do." "Why?" Brian was quiet for a long moment. "Because I never got to say goodbye properly. Maybe this is my chance." Roger nodded, understanding flooding his face. "Or maybe it'll break you." "Maybe," Brian admitted, "but I think I need to find out." The night of the London show arrived like an inevitability. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, calling out cues, checking equipment. Adam Lambert warmed up his voice in a distant corner. The audience roared beyond the curtain, 20,000 people waiting for magic. Brian stood in the wings, alone. He'd checked his guitar strap 3 times. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. Around him, people moved and shouted and prepared, but he existed in a bubble of terrible, quiet anticipation. He thought about the last time he'd seen Freddie alive. November 1991, at Freddie's home in Kensington. Freddie had been so thin, so tired, but his eyes still held that spark. They'd talked about music, about the album they were rushing to finish, about everything except what was really happening. When Brian left that day, he'd hugged Freddie carefully, afraid of hurting him. Freddie had whispered, "Thank you for the music, darling." 3 days later, Freddie was gone. Brian had never recovered from the incompleteness of that goodbye. Too quick, too quiet, too much left unsaid. 2 minutes, Brian, a stage manager called. He exhaled slowly, picked up his guitar, and walked toward the stage. The arena lights dimmed, the crowd's roar built to a crescendo, then fell to an expectant hush. Brian stepped into a single spotlight, alone on the vast stage. He strummed the first chord of "Love of My Life." The audience erupted immediately, recognizing the song, but Brian didn't hear them. His focus narrowed to the guitar strings, to the melody, to the breath he was trying to keep steady. Behind him, light began to gather on the massive screen. Soft at first, then brighter, taking shape. The crowd saw it before he did. The roar intensified. People stood, phones raised, some already crying. Freddie appeared, not as a memory, not as footage on a screen, but as presence. The projection was so precise, so lifelike, that for a heartbeat, the entire arena seemed to believe he was actually there. That somehow, impossibly, Freddie Mercury had returned. Brian kept playing, eyes locked on his fretboard. He couldn't look up yet. If he looked up, he wasn't sure what would happen. Then Freddie began to sing. The voice that had been silent for 30 years filled the arena. Warm, tender, achingly familiar. "Love of my life, you've hurt me." Every word precisely as Freddie had sung it decades ago, but now weighted with the knowledge of everything that came after. Brian's fingers trembled on the strings. He forced himself to keep playing. The audience was sobbing, singing along, but he barely heard them. All he could hear was Freddie. Finally, he looked up, and the world stopped. Freddie stood there on the screen, impossibly vivid, smiling that soft smile Brian had seen 1,000 times. The hologram moved with Freddie's characteristic grace, microphone held loosely, body swaying slightly to the music. Every gesture authentic, every expression real. Then the hologram extended its hand. Brian's breath left his body. He knew this moment was coming. They'd rehearsed it. He knew it was just projection, just light and technology and carefully programmed movements. He knew Freddie wasn't really there, but his hand rose anyway. It trembled as it moved through the air, rising toward the screen, toward that outstretched palm. The audience held its collective breath. 20,000 people watching a man reach for a ghost. Brian's fingers met the projection, light and shadow and memory. Nothing solid, nothing real, but everything that mattered. For one impossible moment, time bent. The past and present occupied the same space. Freddie was there and not there, gone and returned, lost and found. Brian's eyes closed. His hand remained lifted, touching nothing, touching everything. The arena erupted in sobs and cheers, a sound like collective heartbreak and healing happening simultaneously. But Brian heard none of it. In that moment, there was only Freddie, only the friend he'd lost, the brother he'd mourned, the genius he'd never stopped missing. "I'm sorry," Brian whispered, words lost in the music and the noise. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I didn't say everything I should have said." The hologram's eyes seemed to meet his, warm with understanding, with forgiveness, with love. "Thank you for the music," Brian breathed, echoing Freddie's last words to him. The final verse approached. Brian lowered his hand, forced himself to finish the song. His voice cracked as he sang the last line with Freddie's projection, their harmony imperfect and perfect and devastating. The last note faded. Freddie's image lingered for one more heartbeat, that gentle smile unchanging, then slowly dissolved into light and memory and air. Brian stood alone on the stage again. His guitar hung from his shoulder. His face was wet with tears he didn't remember shedding. His entire body shook with the force of 30 years of grief finally, completely released. The crowd roared, but it sounded distant, underwater. He blinked, trying to focus, trying to return to the present. Around him, the arena was chaos. People holding each other, crying openly, singing the chorus over and over like a prayer. Adam Lambert stood in the wings, hand over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. Technicians had stopped working to watch. Security guards wiped their eyes. Even the hardened tour veterans looked shaken. Then, softly at first, the audience began to sing. Not just the chorus, but the entire song, voices rising in waves. They were singing for Brian, for Freddie, for everyone who'd ever lost someone and wished for one more moment. Brian listened, guitar still in hand, and realized something profound. He had never grieved alone. Every person in this arena, everyone who'd ever loved Queen's music, had carried a piece of Freddie forward. The loss wasn't his alone. The love wasn't his alone. The memory would never be his alone. For 30 years, he'd felt the unbearable weight of survivor's guilt, the crushing responsibility of keeping Freddie's legacy alive. But standing here, hearing 20,000 voices singing "Love of My Life" back to him, he understood. He'd never been carrying that weight by himself. When the crowd quieted, Brian lifted his head. His eyes were still wet, but something had shifted. The grief remained, it would always remain, but the loneliness had lifted. The door he'd been afraid to open had swung wide, and instead of destroying him, it had set him free. He touched his hand to his chest, over his heart, and whispered so quietly the microphone barely caught it. "Goodbye, old friend. Thank you for everything." The next song began, and Brian played with a lightness he hadn't felt in decades. The weight hadn't disappeared, but it no longer crushed him. Freddie was gone. That truth remained unchanged, but Freddie was also here, in the music, in the memories, in the love that 20,000 strangers carried forward. As the concert continued, Brian caught himself smiling, a real smile, not performance, not pretense. He looked up at the space where Freddie's projection had been, now empty except for swirling lights, and for the first time since 1991, he felt something close to peace. Some bonds are never truly broken. Some goodbyes take 30 years to complete. And sometimes, when love and loss and memory collide on a stage in London, surrounded by strangers who understand everything you've never said, healing happens in the space between what was and what remains. Freddie was gone, but he had never really left, and Brian at last could breathe again.